Hello everybody, my name is Imbroglio, and today I'm going to teach you how to animate 2D using Blender. So without further ado, let's get started. So some basic user interface. Your tools are over here. This white area is your stage. Anything you draw in the white area is going to show up in your final product. Anything that you draw in the gray area is not going to show up in your final product, which makes it a really good place to write notes to yourself. On the right here, you're going to see many windows, and you can make this bigger or smaller depending how you like your view. But the tool options for your brush is over here. It looks like a wrench and a screwdriver. So here's where you can make your brush bigger or smaller. You can change the opacity. And if you have a tablet that has pressure sensitivity, here's where you would set that stuff up, is by clicking on the little marker that has a target around it. And you can set up the curve however you'd like. Below the stage, you're going to see a dope sheet. I like to have the dope sheet a little bit larger when I'm animating because it has all of the keyframes for every layer for the entire video. So keyframes are basically just frames. When you play your video, it's what you see. So what you see changing right now is just new keyframes on the dope sheet. The keyframes are separated by layers, which you can toggle on or off by hitting the eyeball. You could lock layers, which means that you can't draw on them. See, it's blocking me from drawing on them. And you can turn on onion skinning, which I'll actually get into later. If you want to make new keyframes, you just move the blue marker, which denotes where we are in time, to a new space that isn't occupied by a keyframe, and then just draw whatever you want. And then when you go back and play the video, you're going to see that these frames play right after one another. You can then delete these frames or move them around or duplicate them, stuff like that. If you draw something on one layer, let's say, if I draw something moving, but something on another layer is not moving, like let's say I give this guy a hat on a layer above, then that layer is not going to move, so it's layer specific. If you draw a new keyframe, it's going to replace whatever is on that layer, which is why when you see me move in this Blender file, which I've set up like a presentation, you're going to see the words UI guide stay at the top and everything else change, just because UI guide is actually part of a layer called chapters at the top, which makes it so that the title is always there. So if I toggle that on or off, you can see it disappear up there. Yeah, that's basically it for the dope sheet. If you have questions on it, there's a lot of resources online too, but you're going to use it for everything. Your brush is over here. You can draw, and that's your brush. Your eraser is an eraser. Your bucket fill is a little bit less intuitive. So let's say I want to fill this teardrop. Well, normally you would hit the bucket tool and press it, but what's happening right now is you're filling it with a material called solid stroke, which is the default material that you start with. If you're using the bucket fill like how most people would like to use it, you change that material up here from solid stroke to solid fill. And then when you press it, there you go. And now you can change the color that you fill it with, and you're going to change it. You're going to fill it with a different color. If you were to draw using solid fill, it would look like this. So you can make these cool oblong shapes using it. And solid fill, what it is a different material. Over here, you can actually switch from material view, which for solid stroke is black, and you could switch the color attribute. So this is where you would pick colors and stuff. So let's say I want this green, and I draw a little guy here. That's because I'm in color attribute mode. In material mode, it'll just be black, because that's what the material is. You can set up new materials with different colors and different characteristics, but solid stroke is just a black line. Let's say I really like this green. I can hit this right here. This will save it. So now I've cataloged that color. If I want to navigate back to the purple I was using before, I've already saved it, so I can just go back and forth. And now if I want to add eyebrows in green, I have the color saved. So there's a lot of capabilities for saving colors and stuff like that. The reason I'm telling you not to touch this compass, since Blender is a 3D program, changes your 3D view. But we can stay out of that. If you just press this camera here, if you have ever messed it up, you'll navigate back to where you want to go. So some common issues. Maybe I could save you the trouble, save you the trip to a Blender forum and troubleshoot it for you here. So if you can't see your frames or anything on your dope sheet, it means that you've actually turned off strokes in your outliner. So up here is your outliner. Let's say I turn it off. Now I can't see anything. So I would turn strokes back on. Now my strokes are back, but I can't see anything on my dope sheet. That's because you have to hit this, which will toggle your keyframes to come back. So that's how you would get it back if it ever disappears. If there's a red dot in the middle of your screen, what you've actually done is you've turned on guides, which is up here. So what guides does is it makes it so that you can only draw a circle or whatever guide you have set up. You can press C to turn it on and V to turn it off. Now I can draw freely because the red dot is gone, but yeah, that's something that sometimes you press by mistake. If your tools disappear, that's just because you hit T. You press it, they'll come back. Yeah, that's it. If you can't see the stage, there's a couple things that you could have done. Firstly, you could have done what I said before, where you've changed your 3D view. You can tell because this gyroscope won't be set up the right way, so you can just navigate back to that. Another thing that you might find is that you're in the middle of the dark, so you have no idea where you are, and you want to get back to your stage. So what I do is I zoom all the way out. Now I can see my stage, and now I use the hand tool, which is how I drag around, to drag back so it's in the middle, and then I zoom back in. So that's how you can get back from being in the dark. If everything looks like this, it means you've changed your display. So your display is up here. You've selected wire display, which makes everything look like this. Usually I stick on material display, which is what I use for this video, and render preview is going to show you what it looks like rendered. It's more important for 3D with lighting and stuff, but for 2D you basically just always stay on material because these should be the same. And yeah, now I'm going to get into how to animate using the 12 principles of animation. So the 12 principles of animation were outlined in a book called The Illusion of Life by Ollie Johnson and Frank Thomas. And what they are just things that Disney animators would keep in mind when they were animating. These are not hard rules, and as I'm going to show you, it depends very heavily on whatever it is you're animating. But let's start off with squash and stretch. So let's say we have this penguin, and he suddenly remembers he can't fly, so he falls to the ground. You can see the squash and stretch as I draw it. What's important to note is that when I'm drawing the squash and stretch, I am not changing the volume of the penguin. So if we take this frame where he's flying and the most extreme frame right here, you can see that the volume isn't too changed. It actually should be the same. That's what squash and stretch is. It's not a smear frame. Smear frames are different. So you can see the volume is retained. But again, it depends on what you're animating. So let's say the penguin is like 1,000,000 pounds and has the hardness of a diamond. He would not fall like that, he would fall like this. So understanding what it is that you're drawing plays a big role into how much squash and stretch you'll use, as well as how much you will apply these other principles. So again, it's really situational. The next thing is anticipation, and this is almost universal. There aren't many situations where anticipation is bad to add. You can always add more of it. So let's look at this. Right, that's weak. Our brains don't have enough time to anticipate it, so this doesn't come off as a very hard motion. You may be saying to yourself that this is because our motion is slow, but that's actually not the case, because if I add smear frames, you can see that it doesn't look much harder, because our brains need time to anticipate and expect an outcome. So a big thing with animation is clarity. So let's look at this. It's a lot clearer, right? Not only have I exaggerated the impact so that this guy's eyes are about to pop out of his head, but there's big exaggeration. He's heaving it back, and then there still is a smear frame, but we expect it now, so it feels a lot more powerful. So this is a lot stronger. Our brain has time to breathe. It's clear, and he's been a lot more hurt from it. So going back to clarity, this leads perfectly into staging. So this, what do we think about this? It's actually not great staging, just because our eyes don't naturally want to go to this part of the screen. Normally we want to be looking in the middle, and here you can even see that the poses are a lot clearer. This guy's definitely being more inquisitive. This guy's definitely pointing at something else, as before he might have been pointing at him. If they had facial expressions, you'd be able to see them more clearly here as well. And there are also composition rules for staging that you can follow as well. So you could say that this one follows the rule of thirds, not perfectly, but the rule of thirds would be dividing your screen up into thirds. These are just like nodes where your eyes will naturally gravitate towards. The same thing with the Fibonacci spiral or the golden ratio, the golden triangle, and other things. These are just where your eyes can go if you set up your composition well, and I actually have some examples here. If you ever watch a Kubrick movie, which is actually my first example, The Shining, he does a lot of this. He's very intentional with his composition and his timing, so it could be a good exercise if you want to watch one. Straight ahead and pose to pose refers to how animators draw their drawings. So let's start with pose to pose. You start off by drawing keyframes, and I know before I said that the keyframes are down here on the dope sheet, but in reality, these are just normal frames. They're called keyframes by the program. Keyframes in actuality are these big broad strokes of the motion. So these are like almost checkpoints on the motion with the most exaggerated poses. For a punch, it would be a keyframe for the wind up and then a keyframe for the follow through. So it's just the big broad strokes of the motion. Then you're going to start in-betweening, which is basically filling in the gaps between them, like this. Then when you play the motion, you basically follow it. If you work on a team of animators, you will have someone who does keyframing and also a team that does in-betweening. They are separate departments. So animation is very difficult, and this is a nice way to break it up for consistency. Doing pose to pose is really good for conserving proportions because you'll constantly have a reference. You won't get lost. It's good for setting up timing. Generally, you should be using pose to pose for most motions. Straight ahead is kind of the opposite, so you're not setting up checkpoints with keyframes. You just draw a drawing, and then you follow it up with another drawing, and then another drawing, and then you just kind of like build off of them like that. So it's really good for sporadic things like fire, where you don't need to worry about proportions and shape. And I generally tend to animate in straight ahead, but if you look at my animations, you can tell because the proportions aren't conserved very well. So it's not for everyone, and you should generally stick to pose. I would say you get better a lot faster that way. Overlapping action is confused with secondary action, but I'll make that distinction later. What it is something added to a character to further detail the motion. So let's look back at the penguin really quickly. If we give him a scarf, the scarf drags behind him and then slowly falls to the ground, which emphasizes how quickly he's fallen to the ground and that the scarf needs to catch up because he's hit it so fast. So right now, the scarf is overlapping action. It follows the motion. Slow in and slow out. So generally in nature, things don't move in a perfect linear speed. So this refers to just easing in and out of motion. So let's take a look at a little guy jumping between these 2 points. You can see that there's more frames concentrated towards the beginning of the motion. It peaks in speed at around the middle of the jump, and then it takes a while for him to ease into it. So most things in nature will follow this type of motion. But what happens if we set it up perfectly linear? It looks like this, right? And this does not look natural. It's a big pet peeve when people do this of mine. But again, it depends on the context. If you are animating something that's very robotic, then yeah, maybe it should move in a linear way. In other words, you do not always need to follow slow in and slow out, but most times you should. It depends, again, on the context. So arcs just says that most things should generally follow an arc when you draw them. So let's take a look at this ball bouncing, which is the one from before with the straight ahead and pose to pose. You can see that it follows arcs. Most organic motions will follow an arc. There's a reason that the ball doesn't move like this in a zigzag, because that's not how things work, in the real world at least. So let's take a look at this walk cycle of this gentleman. Right? There's no arcs. It's perfectly stagnant, but that's not how things occur in the real world. So if we were to add arcs like this, it becomes a lot more organic and a lot more believable. And another little tidbit is that when you're drawing feet, you don't really want to have the feet be on the same plane like this, stagnate them. It creates the illusion of depth. So if you see his contact point for his feet, they're actually offset. So he's not walking with the feet perfectly in step like this. You would rather it look like this, where it's a little offset. Secondary action is the thing that's often confused for overlapping action, but what it is an additional action that elaborates or gives context to an action. So it's not detailing the motion as much as it is conveying a story. So let's look at 3 examples. This guy's gonna cut a fish, right? He just cuts the fish, that's it. But let's add secondary action. He trembles, and then he cries, and then he cuts the fish. So you can see how secondary action completely changes the tone of the scene, right? Now let's look at this one. Right, the personality of the character and the flavor of the motion has completely changed. So that's what secondary action is. You're giving characteristics to a character, you're explaining the motion. You should pay attention to secondary action. This is where you can really do your storytelling. Timing. So generally you want to focus on how many frames you have for a given motion. So let's look at this. Right, that was pretty fast. That's because there's only one frame, so it's a very, very quick motion. There's no in-betweens. But now let's look at this. There's one in-between now, this one. So we've changed the timing. But now let's see what happens if we add more in-betweens. The motion gets slower. So it looks more labored. So it depends on what you're doing, but you can add more or less in-betweens to get that motion down depending on what you're trying to convey. So that's just kind of more intuitive. I wish I had more advice for timing, but you will feel it out the more that you use it. Generally, animators work with 24 frames per second, but we don't always draw on 24 frames per second. Oftentimes you'll hear animators talk about drawing on 2s, which is drawing every other frame for a total of 12 frames per second, or sometimes they'll do 3, which is 3 frames per second, or 4s, but generally you're still seeing 24 frames per second, like the computer. So I'll show you what that means, or here's just me explaining it. So this is on 2s. So every other frame, you can see the frame numbers down here, look, 1474, 1476, 78, 80. So it's every 2 frames there's a motion. You can't even really perceive that it's on 2s, right? But now if it's on 1s, it's a lot smoother, right? Generally, on 1s is a lot of work. So most animators go on 2s, but a good example of switching between the 2 is when I made the penguin fall. If I could find him, hang on. Yeah, so this is the penguin falling. So the penguin flies, and I switched to 1s. I even made a note here. I switch to 1s when he starts to fall because there's more frames that I want to detail. It's a more complex motion. So you can switch between the 2. You don't have to commit to 2s or 1s for the entire animation. Okay, let's get back to where we were. So lip syncing. Timing. Oh wait, what? Oh, sorry, my fault, I'm sorry. So exaggeration. Makes a motion more convincing or adds more characteristics, similar to secondary action, but not necessarily. So if we look at the slug, right, that's kind of just like a motion, but everything can always be exaggerated more. So let's look at it again. I add more exaggeration here. I make him go down even further. I make it take longer for him to come up, right? I make him clap back a bit. I make him get even bigger than he was before, and then explode. So let's look at the difference. So it adds more characteristic to the slug. It makes him stickier, it makes the explosion have more weight, things like that. It kind of ties into anticipation, but it's a little bit different because the addition of extra frames can kind of change the motion. Where we'd be looking at secondary action is kind of more changing themes, but this is more inserting frames. So if we're looking at these frames, one thing you're going to notice is it's not like squash and stretch. The volumes are completely different. And that's because we're exaggerating, so it's okay to go off model. You don't have to stay in perfect proportion every single time. It's okay to exaggerate a little bit. Oh, sorry, I did it again. So solid drawing. If you're going to draw in 2D, you should at least have some understanding on how to draw in, by hand. You're going to want to have an understanding of drawing depth in 3D, proportions, perspective, things like that. Drawing people, you're going to need anatomy. But you don't have to be like Rembrandt to animate because you're going to cut fat. And what that means is when you're animating, you're going to draw a drawing so many times that you can't have them be super detailed every single time. You're going to have to know what details to keep and what details to cut. So that's when I say cutting the fat, that's what I mean. So you can have like okay drawing skills, but if you have a really good understanding of motion and of physics, not like academic physics, but like intuitive physics, like weight and hardness, and fluidity, you can actually animate pretty well. but to animate extremely well, you should have a solid foundation for drawing, and that will come with time. Don't give up, keep trying. It'll come with time. Appeal is also something that's very hard to teach, but I'm going to try and attempt to. So you want the things that you draw to look appealing, and that doesn't mean everything should be like super pleasing to the eye, because you can make things look ugly on purpose to convey a point, but we should still think that it's well made. In other words, you can't like have the animation and the motion look really gross, because people won't want to look at it. It's important to make it somehow appealing, even if that appeal is not readily apparent. So this drawing, not a great example, but it's not super appealing, partially because of the pose and partially because there's no solid drawing. But now let's look at this. It's a little bit more appealing just because there's complexity over here and there's more simple edges over here. So what you're gonna see is in a lot of poses, because a rule of thumb is that poses should be easily identifiable by the silhouette. And part of that is because of the pairing of complex and simple lines. So if it's too complex, our brains might not want to look at it, and if it's too simple, our brains might not be as interested. So you have to pair these kinds of edges with one another. Taking a look at these examples, you can see that I've paired more complicated edges with a lot more simpler edges and rounded edges. And it hones your eyes on certain details, and it's used to help engage your viewer. So let's talk about character design. If you want to use shapes to convey a character, I think that's a great start. So let's look at some shapes. So you should be able to kind of feel or intuit certain emotions from these shapes. So this should be a lot friendlier because of the rounded edges. This one should be a little bit more aggressive and intimidating, and this one may be a little bit more stable or inert because of the way that the shape is. So shapes do have kind of characteristics, but let's draw characters over these shapes. Let's do it with clowns. So what you can see here is that this guy looks a little bit happier and more friendly because he has a lot of rounded edges, but the pointed edges on this triangle clown make him a lot angrier, and this guy looks glum, partially because of the expression I've given him, but also partially because of the way that his head is shaped. And something I want to point out is I didn't use all triangles for the triangle guy or everything's a circle for this guy. You can use other shapes as well. I've highlighted the circles in green, the triangles in red, and the square parts in blue. So you can kind of incorporate other shapes into your characters. You don't have to make everything with a triangle or everything with a circle, because if everything looked like a triangle for that guy, he would look something like this, and that would look kind of weird, So let's kind of zoom out a bit and look more at the edges. You can see that I've paired more simple edges with more complicated edges, still following that rule. And now let's look at their bodies. So if we add bodies to them, once you kind of start drawing them, you'll get a feel for what you want the character to be. So a lot of this is because I'm pushing the proportions, but you can even see here that this guy still looks more aggressive even with the body, and this guy still looks sadder, and this guy still looks happier and more friendly. You can also use color as a great way to convey emotion. From this, something I want to highlight, and I know I'm all over the place with this, but you should have a clear favorite from these three. The designs are distinct enough and the colors and the shapes are unique enough that you should gravitate towards one that you like the most. And that is a testament to good character design, is because they clearly communicate emotions, and you can kind of tell how they may act towards one another because it's clear. And that's what I said before, animation needs to be clear. You can embed that into your appeal as well. And again, I'm just pointing out that you can see simple and complex shapes. It's almost kind of arbitrary, like how I call the left of this clown's face complex and this side simple. But when you're drawing, just try and keep it in mind. I don't think you'll ever be brought in front of like an animation court of law and need to prove why this is complex and this is simple, but as long as you're not making things overly complex or overly simple, it's okay. And so yeah, you need to experiment with appeal. This one, take with a grain of salt. None of these are hard rules. Again, none of them are hard rules, but like some things to get you started. Yeah. Okay, next I'm going to talk about onion skinning. Onion skinning is one of the things I said you can find in the dope sheet. So this is what you're going to look like when you look at a layer. Onion skinning is this circle here. So if we go to maybe like this motion here and I turn on onion skinning, you can see that I can see the frame that comes after, which is in blue, and the frame that came before, which is in green. So it's a good way to track your motion and kind of help you time things like that. So onion skinning, yeah, it displays it like this down here. I have a little example for you. When it's on, it will look like this, where there's those little 3 guys coming through. So it's a good way to kind of track your motions. And if you want to alter how you onion skin, you come over to the stroke menu, which is what you would do to see it from before. You would do this drop down menu, or I'm sorry, actually, you would click this, and this will open up this little menu down here, which is the stroke menu. And here you're going to see there's different layers, but you can scroll down to the bottom and you'll see onion skinning. And it explains, or rather it details, the opacity that you can set onion skinning to. So now if I turn it on, it'll be really bright. See, you can filter how many keyframes before and after you see. Generally, I like to have 1:1, but some people like to have more so they can understand the motion, like the view from 1,000 feet, and see more of what's going on. But generally 1 to 1.5 should be fine. Yeah, that's basically onion skinning. Old animators used to use a light box, which was they would put a thin piece of paper on like a table, and then they would put it on a box that had light shown through it, and they would put more pieces of paper on top of it. So you would be able to kind of see, very similar to what onion skinning does, the thing that you drew before and the thing that you might draw after if you were to wedge it between them. So it's kind of derived from that. And yeah, lip syncing might be important depending on what you're animating, but it's a lot of trial and error. Something I did in the beginning, which you're not really supposed to do, is lip sync every single letter that they speak. That'll look weird, but really just keep rewatching it, and it's a lot of trial and error. There are certain guides you can follow, like I have one here for you. This is kind of what I use. That shouldn't be there, yeah. But these ones are kind of what I'll cycle through for certain letters, but I'll change it and squash and stretch the mouth to convey emotion more. But yeah, if you want to try using this, you can go ahead. So tweening. Tweening is using the computer to in between, hence the term tweening, 2 frames. So it's very mechanical. An example of it can be seen right here. That's a tween, right? The computer is just taking 2 points that I set out, and it's using these blue frames right here to tween it. So how did I do this? I'm actually going to walk you through it, but what I did is I changed my mode from draw mode to edit mode, and then from there I moved the position of the character, and then I went to the grease pencil, which will come up in a second, and interpolated the sequence. So I know that's a lot, but let me delete what I did here, and I'll just show you. So I have my character. I go to up here, switch from draw mode to edit mode. This is where I can move my character around. It is also where I can make them bigger, smaller, and where I can rotate them. So there are a lot of things you can do in edit mode. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to make a new frame where I move him over here. And now I want to interpolate between these positions. So I move my cursor anywhere in between them on that layer, it doesn't matter where. And I come up to grease pencil up here and I click that. And then I go to interpolate sequence. And now those blue frames have appeared, and if I play it, you can see that I've basically tweened the frames. There's a menu that's going to pop up here, and here's where you can change the function that it follows. So if I make it linear, it'll look like this instead of before, which was quadratic. So you can play around with the tween that you get, basically. So I know that's a lot, but that's the basics of how to tween. That's me talking about the menu. The reason I go into edit mode and I move it is because what happens if I want to tween this to this? You can see that the drawings are different. So when you tween different drawings, it doesn't really know how to interpolate it unless the lines are exactly the same. So that's why it's important to go into edit mode and drag it. But you can also play around with it, because look at this. You can make him switch into a hamburger. So there's a lot of things you can do with tweens, but I generally don't use them. But it could save you time. Animation's a lot of work, so that's how you would use them. So some final tips to take home with you is be patient. Animation is a lot of work. It's very labor intensive and time consuming, and there's a reason that a lot of artists are just artists and not animators. But if it's something you're passionate about, be patient, don't get discouraged, and don't be afraid to experiment and make mistakes. really push the limits of what you can animate, and that's the way you'll grow, is by taking on things that you're unfamiliar with or trying your best, basically. And these things apply to like anything you do. Like, look closely at animations that you like or people who are doing something that you like, and think about the things you like about them. Specifically for animation, on YouTube you can use the period and the comma to cycle frames on a given video. So look closely at the frames that they've drawn and how they space them, and you'll notice that they don't draw a lot of frames, they draw a lot of the right frames. So take notes from people who are further along than you. Don't get discouraged. Manage your expectations as well. It's a lot of work, so don't expect to be really good early on, but don't get discouraged either. And don't give up. Yeah. So this should be everything that you should need to start animating. Blender is free, and hopefully now it's easy to use. And yeah, I hope to see the things that you guys put out, and have fun animating.